If you've ever owned a piece of land, you know how personal it is, how every tree, every rock, every inch feels like yours and yours alone. But imagine waking up one day to discover that a woman named Karen, armed with an HOA board, a construction company, and unchecked arrogance, had built not one, not two, but 98 houses on your land without your permission. While you were away caring for your dying father, this is exactly what happened to me. And if you want to see how a quiet landowner flipped an entire fraudulent HOA empire upside down with nothing but proof, patience, and the law, then don't miss a second of this wild, real-life takedown. Subscribe to Sham Stories and buckle up, because it only gets more unbelievable from here. It started about a year and a half ago when I inherited 72 acres of unused, unzoned land in a quiet corner of the state after my grandfather passed a wayland that had been in our family for 3 generations. Passed down with love, guarded with care, and most importantly, properly documented with every legal record, survey, and deed you could imagine. I'd grown up visiting that land every summer as a kid, fishing in the stream, riding bikes down the old gravel trail, and sleeping under the stars on warm August nights. Always knew that one day it would be mine, but I had no idea that the moment I claimed it, someone else would try to take it. Kieran wasn't just any neighbor, she was the self-appointed president of an HOA that had mushroomed out of nowhere over the past 2 years as new developers started building homes in what used to be wide open, undeveloped countryside. She had built an identity out of control over lawns, trash bins, mailbox heights, garage door colors, you name it. Karen had an opinion and a rulebook. The problem was, my land wasn't part of her HOA. It had never been zoned, never been seeded, and had never even been included in any municipal development plan. But Karen had dreams of expansion, and apparently dreams of profit. While I was away for 8 months in another state taking care of my sick father and handling estate matters, Karen and her committee decided that the open land next to their little HOA paradise was unused, unclaimed, and in need of community development. That's right, they simply took it. I returned home to find bulldozers in what used to be my family's orchard, concrete poured over the trails I used to bike as a child, and foundations already in place for dozens of homes. I couldn't believe my eyes. I pulled up the deed, drove straight to the county clerk's office, and confirmed what I already knew. I was still the legal owner of all 72 acres. But that didn't stop the construction. By the time I got a lawyer involved, they had already completed 32 homes. 2 months later, that number climbed to 70, then 98. I couldn't understand how no one noticed how the city, the inspectors, the developers just kept going. That's when I realized the documents Karen submitted to the city planning board were for a completely different parcel of land, located 15 miles away, and those documents were full of fraudulent signatures, made-up LLCs, and forged engineering reports. She had either bribed or conned her way through the cracks of the system. My attorney was stunned. I hired a forensic document examiner who confirmed the fraud. The city froze, the planning board panicked, and Karen, she doubled down. She issued HOA violation letters to my mailbox. She sent me invoices for monthly dues. She even threatened to fine me for not maintaining a lawn on land that was still in her own paperwork, supposedly public space. It got worse. She tried to trespass, called the police when I installed a camera, and even tried to sue me for interfering with neighborhood harmony. She said I was harassing her by claiming ownership. But I wasn't just claiming ownership, I had every inch of it in writing. Meanwhile, her construction company, some shell corporation linked to her cousin, had already sold pre-built homes to unsuspecting buyers who were now living in houses sitting illegally on land that didn't belong to them. I could have gone nuclear from day one, filed to evict every single homeowner, sued for damages, and bulldozed every house. But I didn't. I gave Karen multiple chances to back off, to settle it quietly, to fix the mess she made. She refused. Every time, so I started documenting every drone shot, every letter, every false statement, every transaction. I compiled a 500-page report and turned it over to the State Real Estate Commission, the Attorney General, the IRS, and the FBI. That's right, the FBI got involved because Karen's HOA wasn't just expanding illegally. It was tied to financial fraud, forged mortgages, and tax evasion. Turns out, this wasn't her first shady development project. Now the homeowners, many of whom had no idea what they were walking into, were facing the consequences. And I made it clear that I wasn't after them. This was after Karen. Some of the residents even joined my lawsuit against her, furious that they'd been scammed. And the best part? The final county survey revealed that the entire 98-home development sat 100% on land that was mine, and I had never signed a single inch of it over to anyone, not even a driveway easement. The media caught wind, reporters showed up, and Karen vanished for a week before resurfacing with a wild press conference where she accused me of stealing her neighborhood. The sheer audacity was unbelievable. I had the deeds. I had the footage. I had the court on my side. And now, I had a chance to expose an HOA president who thought she was above the law. You won't believe what happened when the FBI finally knocked on her door, and you're going to want to stick around, because in the next segment, I'll show you how a single court ruling flipped everything and brought her entire fake empire crashing down. Subscribe to Sham Stories now, because this saga is only just heating up. The moment I filed the official motion to halt all development and reclaim exclusive possession of my land, the fuse was lit, and Karen, true to her manipulative and tyrannical form, did not back down. Instead, she went on the offensive, treating the entire legal action as some sort of game, as if the very real deeds and survey maps I provided were suggestions rather than the law. And doubling down with threats, fake citations, and increasingly desperate antics designed to intimidate and stall. Within just a few days, she called a surprise community meeting that wasn't even permitted by the city, where she screamed through a megaphone in the middle of the makeshift development's main street, telling everyone in attendance that I was a land pirate trying to extort money from honest families, despite the overwhelming proof that every home had been built illegally. She had printed flyers with my face on them, labeling me a scammer, and passed them around like it was a war campaign. She even claimed to have insider connections at the county zoning board, who would soon nullify my claim and designate the land as part of the HOA retroactively. The audacity was almost laughable, but behind the theatrics was a real and costly situation. The people who had bought homes, many of whom had families, were in a legal limbo, and the construction firm was trying to move forward with more building even after they were served a cease and desist. When my attorney showed up on site with county officials to conduct an inspection, Karen tried to physically block the driveway in her golf cart, screaming that it was private property. Let that sink in, she told county zoning officials. They had no right to inspect a development that wasn't even legally zoned and was built entirely on my land. When the officials showed her the boundary maps, she flat out denied their validity, claiming her maps from the HOA archives were more accurate. What she didn't know was that I had already filed for an emergency injunction, and within 48 hours, a judge granted it, stopping all activity on the property, suspending any sales or transfers of the homes, and launching a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. Karen lost her mind. She organized protests in front of the courthouse, wore a sash that read HOA President for Life, and hired an online legal consultant who turned out to be an unlicensed fraud. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, calm, and consistent, letting the documents do the talking. The State Real Estate Commission began a formal audit. The IRS opened an inquiry into the funding and tax reporting of Karen's various shell companies. Turns out, she'd registered no fewer than 6 separate LLCs in her husband's name, each claiming ownership of community assets that were, in fact, mine: wooded trails, a fishing pond, and even a small log cabin I had inherited with the land. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came when we subpoenaed her communications with the construction company. In an email chain dated 6 months before I returned home, Karen wrote, "The old owner won't be back. He's tied up with family estate stuff. Let's get this done fast and file it retroactively." That single sentence proved malicious intent and awareness of wrongdoing, and it became the centerpiece of our case. As more homeowners came forward with stories of deception, missing closing paperwork, surprise dues, HOA fines issued for trivial things like garden gnomes and barbecue grills, it became clear that Karen wasn't just expanding an HOA, She was running a small criminal empire, fueled by ego and deceit. One of the residents, a school teacher named Lisa, told me in tears that she'd put her entire life savings into her new house, only to find out the title was worthless. I promised her I wasn't trying to ruin Livzai, just wanted to hold the people accountable who had turned my family's land into their personal piggy bank. Karen, however, responded by posting a fake warranty deed on the HOA website, claiming she had purchased the land through a community trust. She even forged my grandfather's signature on one of the documents, a man who had been dead for over a year before the date on the paperwork. That move alone brought criminal forgery charges into the mix. When local news picked up the story, Karen tried to spin it as a land grab conspiracy, claiming I was working with foreign investors to destabilize the neighborhood. But the truth was already out there. I was working with the law, not against it. And it was only a matter of time before the consequences started to crash down on her. The judge assigned a land surveyor to perform an independent boundary verification, and the results were identical to what I had presented. Every single inch of the HOA's so-called expansion sat squarely on my property. Karen's entire Phase 2 development was invalid. The county revoked all unapproved permits, froze the HOA's accounts, and issued a warrant for the arrest of her fraudulent legal consultant. And yet, even after all that, Karen still refused to give in. She showed up at a county meeting with a binder full of fake maps, tried to scream over every speaker, and then stormed out yelling that she was being targeted because she was a woman in leadership. But the truth had no gendered, had signatures, land deeds, tax records, and a mountain of forged paperwork that pointed to one woman who had tried to steal nearly 100 homes worth of land because she thought no one would notice. But I did notice, and I wasn't going anywhere. By the end of that month, with the investigation in full swing, subpoenas flying, and construction halted, Karen was still holding HOA meetings in her garage like nothing had happened, giving out neighborhood awards and charging families fines for unapproved solar lights. But justice moves fast once the truth is out. And she was about to get her biggest surprise yet, because the next hearing wasn't just going to be about zoning or boundaries. It was going to involve federal charges, FBI involvement, and the unraveling of every fraudulent LLC she ever touched. Keep watching, because in segment 3, the federal agents make their move. Karen's entire empire starts collapsing, one lie at a time. It was early morning when the dark SUVs rolled up the gravel road leading into the development Karen had claimed as her kingdom. Their blacked-out windows and federal tags instantly silencing even the most vocal HOA loyalists who had gathered for their usual morning complaints and coffee routine. And as the vehicles parked in a neat row outside what Karen had begun calling the HOA headquarters, which was, in reality, just a model home she'd commandeered as her personal office, outstepped 4 men and 2 women in clean suits with the unmistakable authority of federal agents, badges flashing under the bright sun. Not a single word needing to be spoken before everyone watching knew something massive was about to go down. Karen, who'd just emerged from the house wearing a red blazer and a sash with President Emeritus stitched into the fabric, froze mid-step as 2 of the agents approached her with clipboards in hand and cool expressions that made it clear they weren't here for negotiation or HOA gossip. Karen Elms, the taller agent asked, already knowing the answer. We're here under authority of a federal court order to inspect and seize records relating to fraudulent land claims, forged deeds, and financial misappropriation tied to this property. The silence that followed could have swallowed the whole street. Karen blinked twice, tried to recover, and then sputtered, "I'm the acting president of this development. This is a private community. You can't just..." But before she could finish, the female agent next to him cut her off with a calm but firm, "Ma'am, please step aside and allow us to proceed. You're not under arrest yet, but obstruction will change that." Karen backed up like a wind-up doll, still gripping a full legal binder that was quickly taken from her by one of the other agents. And the residents who had once cheered her leadership now stood silently on their porches or behind hedges, unsure whether to feel fear, relief, or sheer embarrassment for ever having believed her wild version of reality. Inside the model home, agents began collecting boxes of files, hard drives, printed contracts, some marked with forged signatures, Others hilariously labeled confidential HOA strategy, and what they found wasn't just damning. It was organized corruption masquerading as suburban order. There were invoices billed to homeowners for repairs that were never made, checks written to contractors who didn't exist, and most importantly, ledgers that traced payments from homeowners to shell LLCs connected to Karen's personal bank account. One folder labeled Land Acquisition Strategy contained a typed-out plan to intimidate me with legal delays, public smear campaigns, and even suggestions to find dirt on my family to discourage court action. It was a masterclass in ego-driven fraud, and the agents knew they'd only just scratched the surface. Meanwhile, back at my actual home, the old cabin Karen had tried to list as community storage in a recent HOA newsletter I sat with. My wife and our real estate attorney, watching the whole thing unfold live through drone footage provided by a local journalist who'd been documenting the scandal. "Looks like the feds aren't pulling any punches," I said, sipping my coffee. "It's about time someone treated her like the criminal she is." But Karen wasn't done. Somehow still thinking she could spin her way out of the disaster, she held a makeshift press conference from her front porch later that afternoon, with two diehard supporters standing awkwardly behind her as she claimed she was the victim of a deep state conspiracy designed to target female leaders in property governance. It would have been comical if it wasn't so deeply delusional. What she didn't know was that a parallel investigation had just been launched by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, looking into how she managed to secure false zoning approvals in the first place, and whether anyone in the county office had been bribed or manipulated to let the illegal construction begin. By the end of that week, 2 former zoning board members had been suspended pending investigation, and one low-level clerk admitted under oath that Karen had pressured and confused him into signing off on a land use document he didn't fully understand. While Karen was throwing tantrums on Facebook and trying to rally support by claiming I was a land baron using government thugs, I remained focused on the legal strategy. My legal team filed for a complete restitution package, seeking to recover not just the value of the land, but damages for fraud, defamation, emotional distress, and lost future value. We didn't just want to win, we wanted to set a legal precedent, so this never happened to anyone again. And with every passing day, the case grew stronger. Former HOA board members, sensing the storm approaching, began flipping one by one. First was Susan, the HOA treasurer, who had originally backed Karen's Phase 2. Got Initiative, who turned over dozens of emails detailing internal concerns about Karen's spending and decisions, including a particularly damning message, where she wrote, "If this ever goes public, we're all screwed." Then came Ron, a contractor who had worked on early construction and admitted he'd been paid in cash envelopes from an undisclosed fund Karen kept in a locked cabinet labeled Community Emergency Fund. When asked by investigators if he knew the money came from illegitimate sources, he said, "I didn't ask questions, I was told the land was hers." The unraveling continued until Karen found herself completely isolated, abandoned even by the residents who once worshipped her brand of faux authority. And while her followers dropped away, I gained allies, local reporters, legal advocates, even a group of homeowners who had realized they were victims just like me, asking if they could join the lawsuit as co-plaintiffs. By the time the federal case was ready for preliminary hearing, my attorney told me something I'd never expected to hear. We might have a RICO case here. That meant organized racketeering, a much more serious charge than simple fraud, and it would carry prison time, asset seizure, and lifetime bans from anything remotely involving public trust or fiduciary duty. Karen would go from self-proclaimed queen of a fabricated kingdom to a disgraced felon whose entire story would be taught in law schools as a cautionary tale. As the court date approached, she made one final desperate move. She sent me a personal letter, handwritten, rambling, and full of fake apologies and veiled threats. She begged me to drop the vendetta and consider the families who will suffer if I didn't show compassion. But compassion was never part of her vocabulary when she decided to destroy my family's legacy. She didn't care about the families when she billed them for emergency pet assessments or fined them for wind chimes. She didn't care when she built 98 homes on someone else's land without blinking. And now, with the law breathing down her neck, she expected mercy.
Not a chance.
In segment 4, the courtroom showdown begins. The judge makes a powerful statement about property rights. And Karen finally hears the words she's feared all along under oath, in front of everyone she ever tried to deceive. The courtroom was packed with observers by the time the judge walked in. Reporters, former homeowners, curious law students, and even to zoning officials who'd been subpoenaed for testimony. All packed shoulder to shoulder in a room that now held the weight of a scandal that had spilled far beyond one delusional HOA president's bad decisions. Karen sat stiffly in a charcoal gray suit that seemed to sizes too large for her shrinking frame, no longer wearing her HOA sash or the smug grin that once accompanied every petty rule she enforced. Instead, she fidgeted with a legal pad and occasionally threw desperate glances toward the double doors as though expecting someone to burst in and call the whole thing a mistake. My wife and I sat quietly across the room, flanked by our legal team, our eyes fixed on the bench as the judge called the proceedings to order. And it didn't take long for the truth to begin unraveling an official record. The first witness was an FBI forensic accountant who calmly presented spreadsheets, bank statements, and financial records that showed how HOA dues had been siphoned into multiple LLCs, all connected to Karen's personal expenses, lavish spa trips, rental cars, even a down payment on a timeshare in Florida under her sister's name. Then came the county zoning clerk, who, now under immunity, testified that Karen had submitted fake property maps with forged notary seals and used her position to intimidate him into approving them, making him believe her documents had already gone through legal review. But it was Susan, the former treasurer, whose testimony stole the room. With a trembling voice and eyes welling with shame, she told the court how Karen had tricked the entire board into approving construction plans they hadn't seen, convincing them the land was already under HOA control by waiving doctored deeds and threatening expulsion from the board if they didn't fall in line. "We were afraid," she said, voice cracking, and we believed her because she said everything had already been approved. "I didn't know we were building on someone else's land." I didn't know she was lying. The courtroom went silent. As the judge leaned forward, eyes locked on Karen, "Did you or did you not represent to the board and the homeowners that this land was owned by the HOA?" Karen's lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand and repeated the question directly to her. Karen swallowed hard and finally answered, "Yes, but I had reason to believe it was." That was all it took. The judge turned back to the bench and announced that proceedings would move forward into restitution and criminal charges. Karen's face went pale, and the sound of her breathing, ragged and rapid, was loud enough to carry through the microphone system. Over the next several hours, the prosecution presented evidence showing Karen had personally profited over $1.8 million from fraudulent activities and cost my family an estimated $4.5 million in damages, including stolen land value, lost development, potential defamation, legal fees, and personal distress. At one point, the judge held up a photo of my father's original survey markers, ripped from the earth and tossed into a dumpster, and asked the court, "What kind of person removes another man's legacy without hesitation or permission, and then builds fake dreams on top of it?" No one had an answer. Karen didn't look up again when my attorney spoke. He didn't dramatize the facts or lean on theatrics. He simply said, "Your Honor, this isn't just about property lines. This is about power, how it was taken, misused, and weaponized. And now it's time for accountability." The judge nodded and recessed for deliberation. But when he returned an hour later, the air in the room turned electric. He began reading the decision slowly, carefully, as if weighing each word. "Karen Elms, this court finds you guilty of civil fraud, conspiracy to defraud property rights, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We also find your actions to be in violation of federal racketeering statutes and financial misrepresentation laws." The room stirred as the judge continued, "You are hereby ordered to forfeit all financial gains obtained from these actions, pay restitution in full to the plaintiffs, and submit to a criminal inquiry by federal prosecutors. The bailiff stepped forward, but Karen didn't move. For a moment it seemed like she'd frozen entirely, till the judge added, "You are not to contact any current or former residents of the affected community, or interfere with the restoration process of the land. You are also barred from serving on any board or HOA council in any jurisdiction in the United States indefinitely." It was as if a wall had come crashing down on her shoulders. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she stared straight ahead, lost in whatever nightmare her mind had conjured as the reality of her downfall played out in front of everyone. She had once manipulated into obedience. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed for statements. And though I declined to speak on camera, I gave one quote that later ran in every local paper. "You can't fake ownership. You can't lie your way into someone else's life and expect to walk away clean. Not here, not on my land." The court's decision triggered a flurry of legal cleanup work, title reversals, demolition orders, and emergency housing relocations for residents who had unknowingly bought homes on stolen property. Many of those residents reached out to me directly, offering heartfelt apologies and asking what could be done to make amends. I chose not to hold them responsible for Karen's actions. Most were deceived, just like everyone else, and instead focused on working with the state to ensure they received appropriate support, temporary housing, and full refunds. Meanwhile, my wife and I began the long process of restoring our family land, not just legally, but spiritually. We had it resurveyed, cleaned of all unauthorized construction, and slowly began replanting trees and wildflowers that had been torn out too. Make way for cement paths and artificial turf. What had once been a dream reduced to rubble now felt like a sacred mission to rebuild with integrity, honesty, and deep respect for the history beneath our feet. And as the final machines rolled away and the last remnants of Karen's fake neighborhood disappeared, I stood at the edge of the field, looking out over acres of land that had finally been returned to their rightful purpose, and thought, this is what justice feels like. In segment 5, Karen faces her first criminal arraignment. A surprise witness changes everything, and the community finally comes together not for rules or power, but for truth. Karen's criminal arraignment was held in a separate federal court 3 weeks after the civil judgment. And unlike the quieter tone of the earlier proceedings, this one was swarmed by national media, activist groups, former HOA whistleblowers, and even curious onlookers who had followed the story through viral social media clips. Cameras were barred from the courtroom, but that didn't stop the public from lining up outside at dawn to get a seat inside. And when Karen was escorted in this time in handcuffs, wearing a bland county-issued jumpsuit instead of her usual tailored blazer, there was an audible intake of breath from the gallery. Her posture was different now, less rigid, more sunken, as if the weight of public shame had finally begun to crush the delusions she'd built her empire on. Charges against her were staggering: federal fraud, mail-in wire fraud, conspiracy, forgery, identity theft, illegal seizure of private property, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. But the most unexpected element of that first day came in the form of a surprise witness, a former HOA enforcer named Eric Vance, who had worked under Karen as a private investigator hired to track residents, intimidate dissenters, and secretly gather financial records on homeowners she wanted to push out. Eric had been granted partial immunity for his cooperation and admitted to installing hidden cameras around my cabin and other properties at Karen's direction. She wanted leverage, he said under oath. She told me if I didn't help her get dirt on these people, she'd claim I'd falsified my own background check and have me arrested. The courtroom froze when he described how Karen had fabricated anonymous complaints to the sheriff's department in order to justify midnight wellness checks on homeowners she deemed uncooperative. She called it flushing out the rats, Eric added, visibly shaken. But they weren't rats, they were just people trying to live their lives. The judge listened grimly as Eric's testimony unfolded, laying bare a pattern of psychological manipulation, illegal surveillance, and calculated extortion that spanned over 5 years of Karen's reign. As my name came up again and again, I kept my expression calm, but my hands were clenched tight in my lap, my wife gripping one of them firmly to keep me grounded. The prosecutors then revealed that Karen had tried to destroy electronic records the night before the FBI raided the HOA office. She'd physically smashed laptops, microwaved a flash drive, and attempted to burn hard copies in her fireplace. But the forensic team had already copied the entire server remotely 3 days earlier after receiving a tip from someone on the inside, someone whose name we hadn't heard until that very moment. It was Susan, the former treasurer, who had cried during her civil testimony, had secretly contacted the FBI months before any public legal action began, and provided them with backdoor access to the HOA's digital archives. Her cooperation had been the key to unraveling the scheme from within, and when she took the stand again to confirm her role, she looked stronger, more assured. "I couldn't let her get away with it," she said, glancing across the aisle toward me. "I couldn't let her bury another legacy under concrete and lies." The entire courtroom stirred with respect. The judge ordered Karen remanded without bail, citing a high risk of flight and obstruction, and scheduled the trial to begin in 6 weeks. In the days that followed, our town was flooded with journalists and investigators, and it felt like every porch light in the community was suddenly turned on after years of darkness. Residents who had once hidden behind HOA bylaws now stepped forward to share their stories, forming a coalition to expose similar abuses in nearby neighborhoods. Several state lawmakers began drafting legislation to create oversight for HOA governance, and I was invited to testify before a state Senate committee about our experience. I brought with me the original survey marker my father had hammered into the ground the year I was born. 1. Karen had tried to erase him. I placed it on the witness table in front of me as a symbol of what was truly at stake. "This isn't about fences or dues," I told the panel. "It's about the line between public trust and private tyranny, and we crossed it a long time ago." Meanwhile, back at our cabin, something remarkable was happening. Volunteers, former homeowners, construction workers, even teenagers who'd grown up under Karen's rules, showed up to help restore the land. They removed debris, rebuilt fences, replanted native grass, and helped us salvage what little was left of the landscape. We cooked big meals and shared them under the stars, like one giant family, finally free from fear. One night, one of the men who had unknowingly purchased one of the 98 illegal homes approached me with tears in his eyes. "I didn't know, man," he said, "but I believe in making things right. I want to help rebuild what she tried to erase." We shook hands, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a peace begin to bloom, not because the damage was gone, but because the healing had finally started. And through it all, Karen sat alone in a federal holding facility, awaiting a trial that promised to strip away every illusion she had ever built about power, ownership, and control. In segment 6, the trial begins in full. The prosecution delivers a brutal blow with an unexpected piece of evidence, and Karen faces a reckoning she never imagined would come. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the first day of Karen's federal trial. The air tense with anticipation as journalists, legal scholars, victims, and residents filled every seat and stood along the walls just to witness the spectacle unfold. This wasn't just a case of HOA misconduct anymore. It had become a landmark proceeding, the kind that law schools would dissect for decades and advocacy groups would cite when demanding reform. Karen was let in, still in an orange jumpsuit, her wrists shackled in front of her, her once imperious demeanor reduced to something resembling hollow pride. She didn't look at the audience, and she certainly didn't look at us, seated in the front row behind the prosecution. The lead federal prosecutor wasted no time painting the full picture of her crimes, the systematic fraud that siphoned millions. From homeowners, the illegal construction projects, fabricated enforcement mechanisms, the impersonation of law enforcement through fake security personnel, and the intimidation network that silenced dissenters. But what silenced the room was the introduction of a hard drive labeled Karen Backup Final, covered from a secure vault at her former attorney's office. It contained years' worth of emails, spreadsheets, call recordings, and scanned documents, including confidential files that proved she had knowingly built 98 homes on land she didn't own, ignored multiple cease and desist notices, and had bribed a county inspector to falsify property lines. The room gasped as the prosecution played a phone call recording between Karen and that inspector, in which she laughed and said, "If the landowner tries to fight this, I'll bankrupt him, with code violations until he begs me to buy him out." I didn't blink. I had heard rumors of this level of corruption, but hearing it with my own ears drove a nail through the last trace of doubt anyone might have had. The inspector, now also under investigation, testified under a plea agreement confirming that Karen had paid him $30,000 in cash over 3 years to alter zoning maps and suppress building complaints. Witness after witness took the stand. City planners, engineers, former HOA members, and affected homeowners, each recounting their own chapter of Karen's deception. But when the prosecution introduced my father's last will and testament, which included the full deed to the disputed property, it caused a seismic shift in the jury's body language. The will made it clear, not only did I legally own the entire acreage she had built on, but the property had never been legally zoned for the development she had initiated. A GIS specialist testified using satellite imagery to show how Karen had expanded the project past her legal boundaries after being denied permits, falsifying documents along the way. By the end of week 1, her defense team looked like they were merely trying to delay the inevitable. They attempted to paint Karen as someone overwhelmed by responsibility, blaming rogue employees, claiming ignorance, and arguing that she had been manipulated by others. But none of it stuck not when the evidence against her was digital, time-stamped, and signed. Karen eventually took the stand herself, a desperate move that backfired spectacularly. She rambled about being a visionary, someone who had tried to uplift the community and enforce standards, but she quickly unraveled under cross-examination. When asked why she had ignored multiple registered letters from my legal team asserting land ownership, she snapped, "Because I thought he was bluffing, that land was wasted and I made it valuable." The prosecutor paused before replying. "You don't get to steal land because you think you can make it prettier. That's not community service, that's conquest." Her voice cracked then. The jury watched her unravel as she was pressed about her surveillance operations, the hidden cameras, the fake tickets, and the forced evictions. When asked if she regretted any of her actions, she hesitated just a little too long before muttering, "I regret trusting the wrong people," shifting blame once more. That sealed her fate. Closing arguments were delivered the following Monday, and the prosecution's summary was a mic drop. This wasn't mismanagement. This was an empire built on arrogance, exploitation, and theft, and she knew it every step of the way. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict guilty on all counts. Every single one. Fraud, conspiracy, impersonation of law enforcement, money laundering, and more. The judge thanked the jury and turned to Karen. Face stern and unmoved, declaring, "You are hereby remanded to federal custody until your sentencing, which will reflect the full weight of your crimes." Outside, the crowd erupted. The verdict sparked waves across the country, with lawmakers drafting new HOA oversight bills. Media outlets dubbing it the most corrupt HOA case in American history, and residents from other communities stepping forward with their own horror stories. But for me, the true closure came quietly, days later. When I walked the edge of my land again, no fences, no trespassing signs, no construction debris, just peace. My wife joined me, arm around my back, and for the first time in what felt like years, we could see the full horizon unobstructed. In segment 7, Karen faces her sentencing, unexpected restitution is ordered, and we reflect on how a single lie led to the fall of a fake empire and the beginning of a real legacy. Plus, don't miss the powerful final call to action. The courtroom was dead silent the day of Karen's sentencing. A tension so thick it weighed on every breath taken in that ornate chamber as the judge entered and took his seat behind the towering bench. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but reporters filled every available space, their pens poised to document the culmination of what had become a historic trial. Karen was brought in flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals, her orange jumpsuit crisp, face gaunt, eyes glassy. She looked like a shell of the woman who once barked orders through megaphones, issued fines like confetti, and bulldozed dreams with a smile. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was not of rage, but of immense disappointment, a scathing, precise dismantling of every justification Karen had ever muttered. "You did not merely abuse power," he said, eyes locked on her. "You created a shadow government within a neighborhood, deceiving courts, municipalities, and citizens for personal gain." Karen stood motionless as he read the sentence. 42 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the most serious charges, plus $21 million in restitution to be paid through the liquidation of every asset she had touched in the last decade, including the 98 homes she had built illegally on my land. The courtroom erupted not in applause, but in stunned, collective relief. Justice, long overdue, had finally struck. But the real twist came when the judge added one final measure. The entire neighborhood association Karen once ruled would be dissolved, and control of the disputed land returned to the rightful owner. My wife squeezed my hand as the judge announced that not only would I have the legal right to demolish all 98 homes, but the federal government would cover the demolition costs as part of Karen's restitution, making it very clear that her empire was to be fully erased. 1 month later, bulldozers lined up at the edge of my property. I watched as foundations cracked, walls toppled, and history was rewritten with every bite of steel tearing through roofs that never should have existed. I kept one structure standing, a shed that Karen had turned into her personal HOA command post. I had it cleaned, repainted, and turned into a small memorial site for future legal interns to tour, complete with a plaque titled, "How Not to Lead." My story gained traction not just as a legal triumph, but as a lesson in quiet perseverance. Law schools requested permission to cite the case. Journalists hounded me for interviews. I was asked to consult on HOA reform legislation at both the state and federal levels. Our family's once quiet cabin retreat became a symbol of resistance against unchecked authority. But amid all the noise, what stuck with me most were the letters from strangers across the country, many of whom had suffered under corrupt HOAs. They called me a hero, though I never felt like one. I felt like a man who simply refused to be pushed off land his father had loved and protected. One letter from a woman in Nevada read, "You didn't just fight for your property, you fought." For all of us who couldn't, that hit hard. I replied to as many letters as I could. And as time passed, I didn't just win back land, I gained purpose. My wife and I started a legal fund specifically for homeowners fighting against HOA abuse. We offered free legal counsel, and soon enough, we helped shut down another corrupt HOA that had been weaponizing fees and harassment tactics just like Karen's. Our team grew. Former residents from Karen's neighborhood joined us, offering testimonials and eventually becoming advocates themselves. One of them, a young woman who had once been fined for planting a lemon tree in her front yard, became a paralegal and helped dozens fight back against fines, threats, and unlawful liens. Karen's empire may have fallen, but from its rubble rose a movement. Every year on the anniversary of the court's final ruling, we held a gathering at the Shed Memorial. Lawyers, former residents, students, and supporters came together to remember what was lost and what was rebuilt. And as for Karen, she now resides in a maximum security facility hundreds of miles from the empire she once built. Her name became synonymous with unchecked power and eventual ruin. And she never once expressed remorse, but it no longer mattered. She couldn't hurt anyone anymore. In the end, justice wasn't just served in court, echoed through laws, hearts, and neighborhoods that would never again be the same. If you've ever been threatened, silenced, or pushed off what is rightfully yours, know this. Standing your ground isn't easy, but it's worth every battle. Never underestimate the strength of a quiet resolve, and never give in to tyranny, hiding behind rules. Karen built 98 homes on my property thinking no one would dare stop her. Too bad I'm not just a landowner, I'm a fighter. And now, I fight for others too. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you hope, make sure to subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel for more powerful narratives just like this one. We tell the truth, others bury, and your support keeps these stories alive. Subscribe and never let a Karen take what's yours.